Imagine being a mother, holding your newborn close, only to be told that your child cannot drink from your own body. Instead, you must nourish another baby, one that belongs not to you, but to someone who owns you. This was the tragic reality for countless black women enslaved in America, women who were forced into the role of wet nurses. Their own children often went hungry or even perished while they provided the life-giving sustenance to white infants, a cruel system designed to benefit others at the cost of their own families. In the early colonies, the practice of using enslaved women as wet nurses became common. It was rationalized in ways that tried to mask the inhumanity, claims that a black mother's milk could protect white children from disease. But behind the reasoning was a harsh truth. These women were treated as property, their bodies commodified to serve the needs of slaveholders. Every drop of milk taken from them represented both nourishment stolen from their own children and an assertion of control over their lives. Mothers were torn from their babies, beaten if they resisted, and forced to work under conditions that drained them physically and emotionally. The stories of these women are not just accounts of suffering, they are tales of resilience and silent endurance. Many enslaved mothers endured immense hardship while maintaining a sense of dignity in impossible circumstances. They navigated a world where their love for their own children had to be suppressed, their instinct to nurture redirected toward the children of others. The emotional toll was devastating, leaving scars that would echo through generations, shaping perceptions of black motherhood that persist even today. Understanding this history is essential. It is a reminder that the past is never entirely gone. It informs the present in ways we may not always see. The sacrifices and struggles of black wet nurses reveal the layers of injustice embedded in society, the intersection of race, gender, and power. These stories are crucial not only for honoring those who endured, but also for educating and inspiring us to recognize the resilience of mothers who persevered despite unimaginable circumstances. In this video, we will explore the lives of these women, the challenges they faced, the systems that exploited them, and the enduring legacy of their experiences. We will examine personal accounts, historical records, and expert analysis to uncover a side of history often left unspoken. By shining a light on these stories, we aim to honor their memory and bring awareness to the strength, courage, and sacrifice of black mothers. If you find this story compelling, make sure to hit that like button, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more enlightening historical narratives. Your support helps us continue to uncover untold stories and keep important conversations alive. Stay with us as we dive into the hidden world of black wet nurses and uncover a history that is both heartbreaking and inspiring, a story of survival, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of motherhood. As the American colonies grew in the 1600s, life was harsh and precarious, especially for settlers struggling to survive in unfamiliar lands where disease and hardship were constant threats. Among the dangers that haunted these early communities, malaria claimed countless lives, leaving families desperate to protect their most vulnerable members, particularly infants, who were often too young to withstand even the mildest illnesses. In this climate of fear and uncertainty, a disturbing practice took hold: the forced use of black enslaved women as wet nurses. The rationale presented by the colonists was deceptively simple. If not entirely unfounded, they believed that the milk of these women could somehow protect white infants from the devastating effects of disease, particularly malaria. Yet behind this so-called reasoning lay a system of control and exploitation that stripped women of autonomy, dignity, and the most intimate bonds with their own children, while simultaneously asserting the authority of slaveholders over every aspect of their lives. It is impossible to imagine the emotional weight borne by these women, compelled to nurture infants who were not their own while watching their children go without the nourishment that only a mother could provide. These mothers faced the impossible task of suppressing their natural instincts to care for their own babies, as they were pulled away from their families and thrust into the service of others, their every action monitored and controlled. While the colonial narrative framed wet nursing as a medical or protective measure, in reality it was an extension of the pervasive racial and social hierarchies that defined the era, a way to reinforce the idea that black women were property first and human beings second. The supposed health benefits for white children were frequently used as justification for what was, at its, an exploitative practice designed to prioritize the needs of the powerful at the expense of the powerless. Historical records hint at the complex calculations and cruelties behind this practice, revealing that slaveholders often timed their pregnancies and managed household routines with the labor of black wet nurses in mind. Mothers who had just given birth were sometimes required to return almost immediately to the care of white infants, leaving their own newborns in the hands of other enslaved caregivers, who themselves were overburdened and under-resourced. These arrangements were anything but accidental. They reflected the calculated measures by which enslavers maintained control, ensuring that the productivity and utility of their human property were maximized at all times. In many instances, women were literally milked to feed white babies, a practice that reduced human life to a mechanical function, erasing the maternal agency that is so central to motherhood. The notion that this labor could somehow offer protection against disease did little to mitigate the suffering, for the physiological and psychological toll was immense, leaving mothers weakened, exhausted, and heartbroken. Yet within these stories of oppression, there is also a remarkable testament to resilience. Despite the cruelty inflicted upon them, enslaved women developed strategies to cope, to preserve their own sense of identity, and to maintain fleeting but vital connections with their children. Oral histories and personal accounts hint at the silent defiance of mothers who, even under the most restrictive conditions, found ways to sustain their familial bonds. Some mothers whispered songs, left small talk, or carved secret moments to soothe their children, acts of love that persisted even in the face of systemic dehumanization. These small gestures are a reminder that even when stripped of legal and social rights, human agency and maternal instinct endured, quietly asserting itself against the machinery of oppression. The broader implications of this practice extend beyond individual suffering, revealing how health, race, and labor intersected in the lives of enslaved people. The narrative that black wet nurses could protect white infants from disease obscured the underlying truth that their labor and bodies were being exploited to uphold a rigid social hierarchy. At the same time, it created a stark dichotomy in the survival and well-being of children. White infants were nourished and given a better chance to thrive, while the babies of enslaved women often faced malnutrition, illness, or even death. This imbalance left scars not only on the immediate families but on entire communities, as patterns of deprivation and trauma reverberated across generations, shaping perceptions of motherhood, family, and care within the black community. As we trace the origins of wet nursing back to this period, it becomes clear that the practice was as much about power and control as it was about health. The so-called protection against disease provided a veneer of justification, allowing the moral conscience of the colonists to be assuaged while they systematically extracted the labor and love of enslaved women. These women's experiences serve as a stark reminder of how historical narratives can mask the human cost of social structures, how policies and practices framed as practical or medical can conceal profound injustice, and how the resilience of those subjected to exploitation can illuminate the strength of the human spirit even in the darkest circumstances. Understanding this history is not merely an academic exercise. It is an acknowledgement of the lives that were shaped, constrained, and sometimes lost to the machinery of slavery. It challenges us to see beyond sanitized accounts of colonial life, to recognize the real human beings whose suffering sustained systems of privilege, and to reflect on the enduring legacy of those injustices. By bringing these stories to light, we honor the resilience and sacrifice of black mothers who, despite unimaginable hardship, found ways to nurture, endure, and assert their humanity in a world designed to deny them both. The heartache endured by enslaved mothers was unimaginable, a daily reality that compounded the physical labor and relentless demands imposed upon them. These women were not merely separated from their own children. They were forcibly torn from the most intimate and sacred bonds of motherhood, often moments after giving birth, in order to serve the needs of white families. The sight of their infants crying for sustenance while they were compelled to feed another child is a vision that haunts history, a tragic emblem of a system designed to dehumanize and control. Mothers were punished for even the smallest acts of hesitation or defiance, subjected to beatings or cruel measures meant to enforce compliance. The pain, both physical and psychological. Each lash, each scolding, each moment of enforced labor reinforced the brutal message that their lives and their bodies belonged to someone else, that their instincts to nurture were subjugated to a social order rooted in oppression. In the sprawling plantations and households of the American South, this separation was systemic, not incidental. Slaveholders meticulously orchestrated the timing and movements of both white and black families, ensuring that the labor of enslaved women could be exploited to its fullest extent. Mothers who might have wanted nothing more than to cradle and nourish their own children were instead pressed into service, their milk stolen for the survival and comfort of white infants. The cruelty of this arrangement cannot be overstated. Some mothers watched their children weaken or die from lack of proper nourishment, all while they were expected to provide sustenance to another. The emotional trauma of these acts left indelible marks, not just on the women themselves, but on the children who were denied the comfort and sustenance of their mother's care. Generations were affected, as patterns of loss, grief, and disrupted maternal bonding echoed through families long after the institution of slavery was abolished. Yet within this profound suffering, enslaved women demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Despite the constant threats of punishment, they found small, courageous ways to maintain connections with their children, secret acts of tenderness that defied the oppressive structures around them. Mothers would leave tokens, whisper words of comfort from a distance, or memorize the smallest details of their infants' cries and features, clinging to these fragments of intimacy as a form of resistance. These acts, though invisible to those who held power, were profound assertions of humanity, quiet rebellions against a system intent on erasing their identities and bonds. The capacity to endure such anguish while maintaining a sense of self speaks to an inner strength that is both heartbreaking and inspiring, a testament to the unbreakable bond between mother and child even in circumstances designed to destroy it. The punishments and threats faced by these mothers were not merely disciplinary. They were tools of social control, mechanisms to reinforce racial and economic hierarchies. By enforcing separation and punishing resistance, slaveholders communicated a clear, chilling message. The reproductive labor and nurturing instincts of black women were not their own, and their children's welfare was secondary to the convenience and status of white families. This systemic exploitation extended beyond physical separation to psychological manipulation, fostering feelings of guilt, helplessness, and trauma that would ripple through the enslaved community. The enforced caregiving of white infants created a paradoxical existence for these women, simultaneously responsible for life-giving acts and robbed of the most basic expressions of maternal love toward their own children. The legacy of this enforced separation did not vanish with the end of slavery. Historical records and personal accounts suggest that the trauma endured by these mothers continued to shape family dynamics and maternal practices for generations. The loss of agency over one's body and the forced prioritization of another's children over one's own left enduring scars, influencing how subsequent generations perceived motherhood, caregiving, and self-worth. Scholars have noted that these patterns contributed to broader societal stereotypes of black mothers, unfairly painting them as neglectful or harsh, when in reality their capacity to nurture was systematically undermined and denied. The intersection of race, power, and maternal labor created a lasting imprint on both individual lives and the collective memory of the community. Understanding the profound suffering of enslaved mothers helps illuminate the depth of their resilience and the complexity of their lives. These women were not merely victims. They were courageous agents of survival, navigating a world in which every choice was constrained by systemic oppression. Their ability to endure physical punishment, emotional anguish, and the wrenching separation from their children, while still maintaining bonds of love and care, is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. By acknowledging these stories, we honor the sacrifices of Black mothers whose experiences were often silenced, and we gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience and dignity they displayed in the face of unimaginable hardship. Their legacy challenges us to recognize the enduring effects of history on family, community, and identity, reminding us that the bonds of motherhood, even when tested by cruelty, remain profoundly powerful. The practice of wet nursing among enslaved Black women left scars that ran far deeper than physical exhaustion or immediate maternal separation. It struck at the very heart of identity, reshaping both personal and societal perceptions of Black motherhood in ways that would echo for generations. For women who were compelled to nourish children who were not their own, each feeding became a bitter reminder of what was denied to them: the warmth of their own infants, the intimacy of skin-to-skin contact, the unspoken bond that sustains life and nurtures growth. These mothers carried not only the weight of labor, but also the heavy burden of grief, guilt, and helplessness, forced to witness the suffering or even death of their own babies while providing sustenance to white children. They endured an anguish that could scarcely be articulated, yet it became a defining feature of their daily existence. The emotional trauma was compounded by the knowledge that their capacity to love, to nurture, and to care for their own offspring was systematically undermined by a society that saw them not as mothers but as instruments of labor and control. The psychological consequences of this enforced caregiving extended far beyond the immediate circumstances. Enslaved mothers were made to internalize a system that labeled them as insufficient or neglectful, a cruel inversion of reality in which their sacrifices and devotion were invisible, and their suffering was misinterpreted as moral failing. In the eyes of the dominant culture, the absence of Black mothers in their children's earliest months became a justification for a host of stereotypes portraying them as uncaring or morally deficient, while white children, nourished and protected, were held up as the beneficiaries of ideal maternal attention. The distortion of perception was deliberate, a tool to normalize exploitation and to reinforce the power structures that underpinned slavery. Black women's love and labor, diverted toward the children of those who owned them, was simultaneously made invisible and weaponized to perpetuate racial hierarchies, embedding a narrative in the collective consciousness that misrepresented the reality of Black motherhood. This distortion was not only societal but personal, as mothers struggled to reconcile their instincts and their imposed roles. The cognitive dissonance of loving their own children while being forced to care for another created a relentless tension, an inner conflict that left emotional wounds difficult to heal. Stories passed down through generations recount the silent resilience of these women, how they memorized the cries of their infants, left small tokens or whispered words when they could, and maintained clandestine bonds that defied the constraints imposed by their enslavers. Even within the confines of exploitation, these acts of maternal devotion affirmed identity and humanity, offering fleeting moments of resistance and connection in an otherwise controlled existence. The emotional toll of these experiences was profound, shaping mothers' perceptions of themselves, their worth, and their roles within both their families and a society that sought to diminish them. The societal ramifications of this trauma were equally far-reaching. Wet nursing reinforced a hierarchy in which Black women's bodies were commodified and their maternal instincts redirected, creating enduring narratives that would influence public perception long after slavery's formal end. These women's experiences contributed to pervasive stereotypes in media and culture, often portraying black mothers as distant or negligent, while idealizing white maternal care. Literature, films, and popular commentary perpetuated these misrepresentations, ignoring the structural factors that dictated maternal behavior and infantilized black women's labor. By obscuring the coercive circumstances and focusing on perceived personal deficiencies, society erased the complex realities of black motherhood, transforming systemic oppression into a lens through which black women were judged and devalued. The interplay between personal suffering and public perception also had intergenerational effects. Children of enslaved wet nurses often grew up with disrupted early bonds, affecting attachment and development, while mothers carried the emotional weight of those disruptions throughout their lives. The trauma of forced wet nursing thus became both a private and public narrative, one in which intimate loss was magnified by societal misrepresentation. Historians and scholars who examine these practices today emphasize that understanding the emotional landscape of these mothers is essential to grasping the full scope of slavery, its impact not only on physical survival but on identity, family, and culture. The resilience demonstrated by these women, their determination to nurture and protect in whatever ways they could, stands as a testament to the enduring power of maternal love, even under conditions designed to suppress it. By acknowledging the profound emotional consequences of wet nursing, we can begin to reconcile the historical record with the lived experience of these women. Their stories illuminate the depth of injustice and the extraordinary capacity for endurance, revealing how trauma and exploitation intersected with motherhood to produce lasting effects on both individuals and communities. In examining this history, we confront uncomfortable truths about the ways systems of power manipulate perception and obscure reality, and we honor the courage and sacrifice of women whose love and resilience persisted in the face of overwhelming oppression. Understanding these narratives challenges us to recognize the enduring strength of black mothers and the complex legacy of forced caregiving, reminding us that maternal devotion can survive even in the harshest of circumstances, shaping both history and the collective memory of a people. In the intricate and often cruel social machinery of the American South, the lives of enslaved women were governed by rules designed not by their own needs, but by the whims and calculations of those who held power over them. And nowhere was this more evident than in the practice of exploiting wet nurses. White slave-owning women, acutely aware of the dependence of their infants on the nourishment provided by enslaved mothers, sometimes manipulated the timing of their own pregnancies with a calculated precision that underscores the depth of systemic control. The intent was deliberate. By synchronizing the birth of their children with the lactation cycles of enslaved women, they ensured that these black mothers would be available to feed white infants at the exact moment they were most needed, maximizing the utility of their labor while minimizing any inconvenience to themselves. This calculated orchestration reveals a level of planning that transforms what might superficially appear as incidental or customary into a methodical assertion of power, a form of exploitation in which human lives and maternal instincts were subordinated to the pursuit of social advantage and convenience. For the women forced into these roles, the consequences were devastating and deeply personal. Each pregnancy they endured, each infant they bore, was immediately overshadowed by the obligation to serve another child, one whose life was valued more highly by the surrounding society. These enslaved mothers were not afforded the luxury of mourning, of bonding, or even of providing the basic sustenance to their own babies, as they were compelled to redirect their milk, time, and energy to the offspring of white families. The emotional strain of this forced caregiving was compounded by the systematic removal of choice and agency, as mothers were coerced into a cycle that prioritized the survival and comfort of white infants while their own children suffered from neglect, inadequate nutrition, or even death. Historical accounts hint at the depth of this cruelty, portraying a world in which maternal love was weaponized, twisted into service of an oppressive hierarchy that deemed the well-being of enslaved children secondary, if considered at all. The orchestration of pregnancies also highlights a chilling intersection between power, biology, and social engineering. Enslaved women were treated as resources, their reproductive cycles monitored and manipulated to serve the strategic needs of the household. The planning of white pregnancies around the lactation of enslaved mothers reflects not only a disregard for human autonomy, but also a sophisticated understanding of biology and timing used for exploitation. These actions underscore the systemic nature of oppression in which every facet of a black woman's existence, her body, her labor, her ability to nurture, was subjected to external control. The manipulation of reproduction in this context was both literal and symbolic. It demonstrated the extent to which enslaved women were denied self-determination, reinforcing the power imbalance at the core of the institution of slavery, while embedding trauma into the most intimate and personal dimensions of life. Yet amidst this orchestrated suffering, enslaved women found ways to endure and assert their humanity, even within the rigid confines of control imposed upon them. Oral histories and recollections suggest that mothers, while forced to nurture white infants, retained a profound emotional connection to their own children, finding clandestine ways to preserve bonds and offer comfort where possible. They whispered songs, left small talk, and memorized the features and cries of their infants, acts of quiet resistance that maintained a thread of maternal identity despite systemic deprivation. These gestures, often invisible to those in power, were profound assertions of resilience and defiance, reminders that the essence of motherhood could not be entirely erased, even when the body and labor were forcibly co-opted. The societal consequences of timed pregnancies and the exploitation of wet nurses extended far beyond the immediate households. By enforcing a system in which black mothers were compelled to serve white infants at critical developmental stages, the institution of slavery helped shape enduring stereotypes and perceptions of black motherhood. Narratives emerged portraying black women as detached, negligent, or morally deficient, narratives that ignored the coercion and trauma shaping their experiences. The very act of prioritizing white infants over their own was twisted into a justification for these damaging perceptions, embedding structural inequities in the collective consciousness and reinforcing societal hierarchies that persisted long after the abolition of slavery. This deliberate distortion of maternal identity illustrates the depth to which power and exploitation were intertwined, demonstrating how intimate acts of care were manipulated to sustain social and racial hierarchies. Reflecting on the orchestration of pregnancies and the exploitation of wet nurses allows us to see the calculated cruelty of a system that commodified human bodies and maternal instincts, reducing them to tools for maintaining status and control. It also illuminates the resilience and courage of enslaved mothers, who, despite impossible circumstances, sought ways to nurture, preserve identity, and maintain connection with their children. Their experiences remind us that history is not only recorded in dates and events but also in the lived realities of those subjected to oppression, and that understanding the calculated strategies of exploitation reveals both the magnitude of injustice and the enduring strength of human spirit. These stories underscore the profound cost of systemic control and highlight the quiet heroism of mothers whose love persisted, even when their agency was denied, and whose resilience echoes across generations. Demanding recognition, empathy, and remembrance. The cruel institution of wet nursing among enslaved black women was far more than a private household practice. It was a mechanism through which racial and social hierarchies were enforced, a deliberate system designed to commodify not only the labor but the very bodies of black women. In the eyes of slaveholders, these mothers were measured not by their humanity or their capacity for love, but by their ability to sustain and nourish white infants, their reproductive and nurturing labor extracted and valued purely for the benefit of those in power. Each act of breastfeeding became both a literal and symbolic assertion of control, transforming the intimate, life-giving bond between mother and child into a transaction dictated by social status and racial privilege. The commodification of black women's bodies was thus woven into the fabric of daily life, creating a world in which maternal instinct and personal autonomy were subjugated to the machinery of oppression, where love and care were converted into instruments of social hierarchy. Within the walls of plantation households, this system was meticulously organized. Enslaved women were carefully monitored, their milk supply, health, and availability orchestrated to meet the demands of white families, ensuring that the most vulnerable and formative months of infants' lives were sustained at the expense of the mother's own children. The timing of births, the allocation of labor, and even the physical space in which mothers lived were all dictated by the social calculus of power and ownership, reinforcing the idea that black women's bodies were not their own. Each day, these women were compelled to perform a role that underscored their secondary status. They were nurturers for white children, workers for white households, and yet denied the most fundamental forms of recognition or care for their own families. The psychological toll was profound, as women navigated a world where their contributions were necessary, celebrated for the benefit of others, and simultaneously dehumanized, their identity reduced to a function within a rigidly enforced social hierarchy. The consequences of this commodification extended far beyond immediate labor. By turning black women's reproductive and nurturing capacities into commodities, the system reinforced a broader societal framework in which race dictated value, access, and agency. Enslaved mothers were taught, implicitly and explicitly, that their worth was measured by their utility to the white family rather than by their intrinsic humanity or the well-being of their own children. This message seeped into the cultural consciousness, shaping perceptions of black motherhood for generations. Narratives emerged portraying black women as inherently neglectful or emotionally distant, as though the inability to nurture their own children imposed by systemic exploitation were a personal failing rather than a reflection of the coercive conditions in which they lived. In this way, the commodification of their bodies not only served immediate economic and social purposes but also perpetuated a psychological and cultural hierarchy that outlived slavery itself, embedding harmful stereotypes into the broader social fabric. The interplay of physical labor and social control was not confined to the domestic sphere. It also operated as a mechanism of broader racial domination. By controlling who could nurse and when, by dictating the bodies and lives of black women for the sustenance of white infants, slaveholders cemented an unmistakable message about power, race, and access. Black women were reduced to vessels through which the next generation of white children could thrive, their own needs and aspirations subordinated to a rigidly enforced social order. Every meal, every act of care provided to a white infant, was an affirmation of a system in which power, privilege, and race were inextricably linked, and every act of deprivation suffered by the enslaved mother reinforced that order. The exploitation of black women's bodies was therefore not merely a domestic or personal tragedy. It was a deliberate tool for sustaining the broader architecture of racial inequality. Yet even within this oppressive system, enslaved mothers demonstrated remarkable resilience, asserting humanity and maternal love in the few ways they could. Oral histories recount the quiet acts of defiance, the secret ways mothers maintained bonds with their own children, from whispered lullabies delivered from afar to memorizing the cries and faces of infants they could not hold. These gestures, often unseen by those in power, became powerful acts of resistance, affirmations of identity and agency in a world designed to erase both. They reveal a complexity of lived experience in which care, suffering, and defiance intertwined, highlighting the courage of women who navigated the impossible tension between survival and maternal devotion. By examining the commodification inherent in wet nursing, we begin to understand how systemic oppression permeated not only the physical lives of black women, but also the psychological, cultural, and social landscapes in which they existed. The exploitation of their labor and bodies reinforced hierarchies of race and class, shaping perceptions that persisted well beyond the end of slavery, and the resilience they displayed stands as a testament to the enduring strength of maternal love under extraordinary conditions. Their experiences illuminate both the cruelty of a system designed to dehumanize and the quiet heroism of women who, even in the face of relentless oppression, found ways to nurture, protect, and assert their own dignity, leaving a legacy of courage, endurance, and unbreakable maternal devotion that continues to resonate across generations. In the grand parlors and sprawling estates of the antebellum South, the lives of white upper-class women were bound by a complex set of social expectations, appearances, and codes of conduct, and nowhere did these pressures intersect so tragically with the lives of enslaved black women as in the practice of wet nursing. For many wealthy white mothers, breastfeeding was seen not merely as a physical act, but as an impediment to the careful curation of fashion, social engagements, and personal comfort, and the cultural notion that a mother's body must remain elegant, poised, and unburdened by the demands of nourishment created a reliance on others to fulfill what was deemed an inconvenient necessity. The labor of lactation, a deeply intimate and essential aspect of child-rearing, was thus outsourced to enslaved women, whose own needs, desires, and maternal bonds were subordinated to the social ideals of whiteness and status. In this context, a black woman's capacity to feed and nurture became a highly valued commodity. Her body and labor leveraged to maintain both the health of white infants and the aesthetic and social standards of their mothers. The consequences of these cultural expectations rippled through every layer of household life, structuring daily routines, labor hierarchies, and maternal experience. White women, constrained by societal norms that equated breastfeeding with impracticality or a loss of elegance, delegated the care of their most vulnerable infants to enslaved wet nurses, whose physical and emotional labor was extracted at immense cost. These women were compelled to endure grueling schedules, nourishing white children around the clock, while often being denied the opportunity to nurture their own offspring, whose lives and health frequently suffered as a result. The juxtaposition of luxury and deprivation is stark. The refinement and leisure of the upper-class mother was made possible by the relentless work, suffering, and grief of the enslaved woman, whose body was turned into a tool of survival and social aspiration for another. In every act of feeding, the inequities of status and race were rendered visible. The intimacy of motherhood transformed into a stage upon which systemic oppression played out with cruel precision. This reliance on black wet nurses was further reinforced by the perception that breastfeeding was not only inconvenient but also socially inappropriate for women of status. The era's cultural narratives painted lactation as a distraction from more refined pursuits, as a bodily necessity that might interfere with fashion, public appearances, or social engagements, and these ideas were eagerly adopted by women who had the means to delegate the task. As a result, the lives of enslaved mothers became tightly regimented. Their time, energy, and milk appropriated in service of ideals that bore little relation to human need or morality. The act of nourishing another's child, once a voluntary expression of care, was recast as a compulsory labor, a measure of obedience and utility, and an invisible yet profound mechanism of social control. The very biology of these women was instrumentalized, their reproductive and nurturing capacity reduced to a resource to be allocated according to the desires of the household, rather than the dictates of nature or maternal instinct. The human toll of this system was immense. Enslaved women were separated from their own children, often forcibly, their babies left vulnerable and undernourished while their mothers labored to sustain another child. And in countless instances, these imposed separations resulted in illness, suffering, or even death for the infants they bore. The emotional landscape was equally harrowing. Mothers were compelled to reconcile the pain of watching their own children suffer with the necessity of providing care for others, a conflict that created deep psychological scars and reshaped perceptions of self-worth and identity. The imposed caregiving of white infants, coupled with the cultural devaluation of black motherhood, reinforced harmful stereotypes, portraying enslaved women as neglectful or uncaring while erasing the coercive conditions that dictated their lives. These distortions became embedded in societal consciousness, influencing perceptions of race, class, and maternal capacity for generations to come. Despite these oppressive structures, enslaved women demonstrated extraordinary resilience, finding ways to assert agency and maintain bonds with their children whenever possible. Oral histories recount quiet acts of defiance and care, memorizing the features and cries of their infants, leaving small tokens of affection, or whispering words of comfort from a distance. These acts, invisible to the household but deeply meaningful, reveal a persistence of maternal love that could not be erased, even in circumstances designed to strip it away. They remind us that while the system sought to commodify and control, the humanity of enslaved women endured, expressed in acts of courage, ingenuity, and emotional devotion that sustained both themselves and their families through unimaginable hardship. By understanding how social ideals of convenience, fashion, and status intersected with the exploitation of black wet nurses, we can appreciate the complexity of these women's lived experiences. Their labor and suffering were essential to the maintenance of societal structures and to the health of white infants. Yet this reliance came at the cost of profound personal and generational trauma. Recognizing these dynamics illuminates both the systemic cruelty of historical hierarchies and the remarkable resilience of mothers whose care persisted under conditions of profound injustice. Their stories reveal a history in which beauty, privilege, and oppression were intertwined, and where maternal devotion endured as a quiet yet unbreakable force, leaving a legacy that continues to resonate in our understanding of motherhood, race, and resilience. Amid the sprawling plantations and carefully maintained estates of the antebellum South, the lives of black infants were shaped not by the gentle rhythms of maternal care, but by a cruel calculus of power and deprivation. A system in which the very sustenance that should have nurtured them was diverted to serve white children, leaving these youngest members of enslaved families exposed to profound neglect and danger, while white infants benefited from the devoted labor of enslaved wet nurses, whose bodies were co-opted to ensure their survival. Black babies were often left to contend with inadequate and unsafe substitutes for the very nourishment they desperately needed. A reality that reflected the broader hierarchies of race and privilege that governed every aspect of life on the plantation. Goat milk, sometimes diluted or contaminated, and even dirty water were all too commonly provided to the children of enslaved women. A tragic reflection of the dehumanizing policies that dictated who received care and who was left to struggle. A system in which the value of a life was measured by skin color and social standing rather than by inherent humanity. The consequences of these practices were devastating and immediate. Infant mortality among the children of enslaved women was alarmingly high, with countless babies succumbing to malnutrition, disease, or simply the absence of the life-sustaining nutrition that their own mothers could no longer provide. In households where black women were forced into wet nursing for white families, their maternal instincts were continually thwarted, their capacity to protect and nurture their own offspring stripped away by both coercion and the rigid expectations of a society built upon exploitation. The pain of witnessing their children suffer, while simultaneously attending to the needs of others, was a daily reality. And the psychological burden of such enforced neglect left scars not only on the mothers, but on the broader social fabric of enslaved communities, creating a legacy of trauma that would echo across generations. The methods used to sustain black infants in these circumstances were often improvisational and dangerously inadequate. Goat milk, when available, might be so diluted or contaminated, offering little in the way of real nutrition, while dirty water introduced pathogens that could quickly become lethal in the absence of medical care. In some cases, families resorted to feeding infants a mixture of dry milk or other makeshift substitutes, a precarious measure born not of choice but of necessity under conditions of forced labor. Limited resources and systemic disregard. Each feeding was therefore a gamble, a precarious act of survival in a world designed to prioritize the health and comfort of white children above all else, leaving black infants to face mortality at rates that were tragically predictable. The juxtaposition of care and neglect, of nurturing and deprivation, highlights the cruel inequities of the system, and underscores the deliberate ways in which the institution of slavery dictated the fates of its youngest and most vulnerable victims. Beyond the immediate physical consequences, the denial of proper nutrition and care to black infants had profound social and emotional repercussions. Mothers who were forced to nurse white children instead of their own experienced deep grief, guilt, and despair, emotions compounded by the high likelihood that their infants would suffer or die in their absence. The act of caring for another child while being powerless to protect one's own introduced a cruel inversion of maternal purpose, creating a cycle in which love and labor were weaponized against those who bore it. These experiences shaped perceptions of black motherhood, both within enslaved communities and in the broader societal imagination, as narratives of neglect or inadequacy were imposed upon women whose suffering and sacrifice were systematically ignored. The moral injury inflicted by these conditions was as severe as the physical deprivation, embedding long-lasting wounds in both individual lives and collective memory. Historical accounts reveal that despite these obstacles, black mothers displayed extraordinary resilience and creativity in their efforts to sustain their children. They sought ways to supplement the meager substitutes available, to protect their infants from illness when possible, and to preserve bonds of care even under strict supervision. Secretly shared nourishment, careful attention to hygiene, and other forms of improvisation became acts of quiet resistance, a testament to the determination of women who refused to surrender entirely to the forces arrayed against them. The stories of these mothers illustrate a remarkable interplay of endurance, ingenuity, and maternal love, highlighting how even in the most oppressive circumstances, the instinct to care for one's children could not be entirely extinguished. By examining the tragic reality of black infants receiving poor substitutes while their mothers were forced to care for white children, we gain insight into the systematic exploitation that permeated every aspect of slavery. The diversion of nourishment was not merely an unfortunate byproduct of circumstance, but a deliberate expression of racial and social hierarchy, a reflection of a world in which power and privilege dictated survival and suffering. The consequences for the children and mothers involved were immediate and long-lasting, shaping generations and leaving a legacy that extends beyond historical documentation into contemporary understandings of maternal care, race, and resilience. These stories remind us that beneath the surface of history lies a deeply human narrative of suffering, endurance, and the enduring strength of maternal love in the face of unimaginable adversity. On the sprawling plantations of the American South, the lives of enslaved women were a constant cycle of relentless labor, their bodies and spirits pushed to the brink as they navigated the dual demands of field work and domestic servitude. And for many, the added responsibility of wet nursing white children compounded their exhaustion and deepened their suffering. From the break of dawn, these women labored under the watchful eyes of overseers, their hands calloused from planting, harvesting, and maintaining crops, while their backs bent under the weight of physical toil that left little room for rest or recuperation. And yet, even as their bodies ached from field labor, they were often called upon to enter the house and attend to infants whose needs were deemed paramount by the household. The act of wet nursing demanded constant vigilance, around-the-clock dedication to feeding, soothing, and caring for children who were not their own, and the emotional strain of nurturing another child while witnessing the suffering or neglect of their own infants added an almost unbearable psychological burden. The exhaustion these women endured was both physical and emotional. Their days were defined by unbroken schedules in which every moment was dictated by the needs of others, leaving little space for personal care, recuperation, or time with their own families. The repetitive nature of the labor fieldwork by day, infant care by night created a form of chronic fatigue that eroded both body and spirit, while the constant surveillance and threat of punishment for perceived shortcomings instilled a persistent anxiety that magnified the strain. Being compelled to provide nourishment to white infants while watching their own children receive inadequate substitutes or fall ill was a form of psychological torment that no amount of resilience could fully shield against. And the combination of overwork and emotional trauma became a defining feature of the enslaved maternal experience. Moreover, the demands of wet nursing were not merely additive but exponential. Unlike domestic chores or field labor, caring for another child required intimate attention and a constant presence, with little reprieve even during nights or brief moments of personal rest. Enslaved mothers were expected to synchronize their feeding schedules with the needs of white children, sometimes being milked at precise intervals to ensure that the infant received the full benefit of their labor, while their own children might be fed infrequently or left in the care of older siblings or other enslaved individuals. This cruel inversion of maternal priorities transformed natural acts of care into instruments of exploitation, and the relentless nature of the work left many women physically depleted, mentally strained, and emotionally fractured. The trauma endured by these women extended beyond the immediate challenges of labor. Being forced to prioritize the needs of white children over their own disrupted the fundamental bonds of mother and child, creating feelings of guilt, grief, and helplessness that would linger for a lifetime. In some cases, infants were lost due to inadequate feeding or neglect imposed by circumstances, and mothers were left to reconcile the anguish of loss with the necessity of continuing their assigned duties. This combination of physical exhaustion and emotional pain formed a cycle in which labor and trauma reinforced one another, leaving little opportunity for recovery and ensuring that the legacy of suffering extended across households, communities, and generations. The overwork of enslaved women as both laborers and wet nurses was also a deliberate tool of control. By keeping these women constantly occupied, plantation owners ensured that they had limited time or energy to resist, organize, or seek relief, and the dual demands of field labor and infant care served to reinforce the social hierarchies and racialized power structures of the era. The bodies of enslaved women became instruments of productivity, their emotional and physical exhaustion a byproduct of a system designed to extract maximum labor while suppressing autonomy, agency, and self-determination. The toll on health was severe. Chronic fatigue, malnutrition, physical injuries, and psychological strain were all commonplace, illustrating how the exploitation of labor extended far beyond economic gain to encompass the systematic erosion of well-being and identity. Yet even amidst such relentless demands, enslaved women exhibited extraordinary resilience. They found ways to sustain themselves, to preserve small moments of connection with their own children, and to assert their agency in subtle but meaningful ways. Whether by sharing knowledge, offering comfort, or finding private spaces for rest and recovery whenever possible, their endurance under conditions that would have overwhelmed most is a testament to the strength of human spirit and maternal devotion, underscoring how care and love persisted even when the circumstances sought to suppress them. The stories of these women reveal not only the depths of exploitation inherent in slavery, but also the profound courage and tenacity required to survive and protect what could be safeguarded, illuminating a history in which labor, love, and trauma were inextricably intertwined. After the formal abolition of slavery, the supposed freedom of black women did little to alleviate the burdens that had been imposed upon them for generations. As systemic barriers continued to shape their lives and circumscribe their choices, particularly in the realm of maternal care and breastfeeding, where economic pressures, discriminatory policies, and social inequities created a complex web of obstacles that undermined the health and well-being of both mothers and infants. The transition from enslavement to freedom did not translate into immediate relief from the expectations of labor. Rather, the economic structures of the postbellum South and other regions ensured that black women were compelled to continue working under conditions that allowed little opportunity for personal care or sustained time with their newborns. And while the nature of their labor shifted from chattel slavery to wage-based systems, the pressures remained relentless, often forcing mothers back into work mere weeks after childbirth, long before their bodies and infants had recovered from the demands of birth and early feeding. Economic necessity was a powerful determinant, as many black families faced severe poverty and limited access to resources, compelling women to prioritize survival and income over the act of breastfeeding. And the lack of institutional support compounded the problem, leaving mothers with few viable alternatives for sustaining their children. Discriminatory policies further entrenched these challenges. Welfare programs, public assistance initiatives, and health services often reflected societal biases that assumed black women would not breastfeed, providing support for formula feeding while simultaneously offering inadequate guidance, resources, or encouragement for breastfeeding. For instance, programs like the Women, Infants, and Children WIC Nutrition Initiative, while designed to combat malnutrition, frequently perpetuated assumptions that black mothers would rely on formula, distributing free or subsidized powdered milk and formula while neglecting comprehensive lactation support, thus institutionalizing patterns established during slavery and ensuring that formula feeding became normalized within many black communities. These policies not only influenced maternal behavior, but also reinforced cultural perceptions that breastfeeding was less attainable or desirable for black women, a legacy intertwined with the historical trauma of having been denied the ability to nourish their own children during slavery. And the consequences of such systemic neglect rippled across generations, affecting infant health, maternal confidence, and the cultural transmission of breastfeeding knowledge. Healthcare systems and workplace conditions exacerbated the difficulties. Many hospitals, particularly in areas with limited resources or segregated medical facilities, failed to provide the support needed for successful breastfeeding, from lactation counseling to suitable accommodations for nursing mothers returning to work. In workplaces, black women were often employed in jobs that offered rigid schedules, minimal maternity leave, and environments hostile to breastfeeding, making it nearly impossible to maintain a consistent feeding routine. Even in more supportive contexts, the lingering effects of historical trauma, societal expectations, and economic necessity created psychological barriers as mothers navigated a landscape where their choices were constrained by external pressures and internalized narratives of inadequacy or impossibility. The intergenerational impact of these constraints is profound. Children born into this context experience the consequences of reduced breastfeeding, including increased susceptibility to illness, weaker early immunity, and the emotional ramifications of disrupted maternal bonding. Mothers carried the weight of historical memory alongside the tangible pressures of post-slavery life, negotiating the emotional legacy of enforced wet nursing with the contemporary realities of systemic inequality. And in doing so, they embodied both the resilience and the vulnerability inherent in a society that had long devalued their labor, their bodies, and their maternal instincts. Communities responded in various ways, developing informal networks of support, sharing knowledge about childcare and nutrition, and preserving cultural practices wherever possible. Yet the overarching structures of inequality continue to shape the scope of opportunity and the daily realities of maternal care. Despite these formidable obstacles, Black women continue to assert agency where possible, navigating the intersection of economic survival and maternal responsibility with ingenuity, strength, and determination. Some turn to collective community strategies, supporting each other with shared childcare, advice, and encouragement, while others leverage the gradual expansion of public health initiatives to reclaim elements of control over infant nutrition. In these acts, we see the continuity of maternal devotion that slavery sought to suppress, a testament to the enduring commitment of Black women to nurture and protect their children, even when societal structures sought to make such efforts nearly impossible. The story of post-slavery breastfeeding thus becomes not merely a tale of constraint, but also one of resilience, revealing the complex interplay of historical trauma, economic necessity, and the enduring drive to care for one's own family amidst the ongoing challenges of a society still negotiating the legacy of its past. In the decades following emancipation, the trajectory of infant nutrition within Black communities was profoundly shaped not only by historical legacies of forced wet nursing and systemic barriers to breastfeeding, but also by the aggressive marketing strategies of formula companies throughout the 20th century, which exploited both economic vulnerability and social inequities to establish patterns of feeding that often perpetuated disparities in infant health and maternal autonomy. As formula became commercially available and widely promoted, advertisements targeted Black mothers with a mix of aspirational messaging, medical authority, and promises of modern convenience, portraying formula as a progressive and sophisticated alternative to breastfeeding while subtly reinforcing notions that breastfeeding was outdated, burdensome, or incompatible with contemporary life, particularly for women balancing work, family, and limited resources. These campaigns did not merely sell a product, they shaped perceptions, embedding a cultural association between formula feeding and upward mobility, modernity, and scientific progress, even as the underlying health risks for infants were often minimized or obscured. The consequences of this targeted marketing were multifaceted. By positioning formula as both desirable and accessible, companies effectively encouraged many Black mothers, already constrained by economic pressures and workplace demands, to abandon or shorten breastfeeding, often without comprehensive guidance on proper preparation, storage, or nutritional supplementation. In many cases, families relied on inadequate water quality or limited access to clean bottles, which exacerbated the risks of malnutrition, gastrointestinal illnesses, and other preventable health issues. The historical echoes of slavery, where Black infants were routinely deprived of maternal milk in favor of white children, found a disturbing continuity in these commercial practices, as the structural inequities that had long undermined breastfeeding persisted under a new guise, now sanctioned and amplified by corporate interests rather than individual household dynamics. Beyond individual health impacts, the widespread adoption of formula in Black communities contributed to the entrenchment of social and cultural narratives about motherhood, nutrition, and care. Mothers were often cast in roles that emphasized compliance with societal or medical expectations rather than agency, and the choice to formula feed was framed as rational, modern, and even aspirational, while breastfeeding was marginalized as impractical or unnecessary, further alienating women from a practice that had historically been part of their cultural and maternal identity. These narratives intersected with policy and institutional practices, as programs such as WIC provided formula as part of nutritional assistance packages, effectively reinforcing the normalization of formula feeding while simultaneously neglecting the provision of comprehensive lactation support or education that might empower mothers to breastfeed successfully. The cumulative effect was a generational shift, where patterns of infant nutrition became deeply entwined with economic and racial inequalities, perpetuating disparities that manifested in health outcomes. Maternal confidence and intergenerational knowledge about feeding practices. Corporate exploitation extended beyond marketing into the realm of celebrity and media representation, as Black infants and families were often featured in promotional campaigns, not as autonomous participants, but as symbols in narratives designed to drive sales and reinforce social hierarchies. These portrayals presented an image of Black motherhood that was simultaneously aspirational and constrained, celebrating the modern convenience of formula while implicitly perpetuating the legacy of devaluation and commodification that had historically defined the experiences of Black women in maternal roles. The use of medical endorsements and authority figures lent credibility to these campaigns, obscuring the social, economic, and health costs that disproportionately affected marginalized communities, and reinforcing a system in which profit motives superseded the well-being of mothers and infants. Amid these challenges, Black mothers and communities demonstrated resilience, seeking ways to reclaim agency and nurture their children within the confines of structural limitations. Informal networks, community support groups, and grassroots initiatives emerged as vital avenues for sharing knowledge about breastfeeding, infant nutrition, and maternal care, creating spaces in which cultural traditions could be preserved and adapted despite pervasive commercial and institutional pressures. These efforts highlighted the enduring strength, resourcefulness, and commitment of Black women to protect the health and well-being of their children, drawing on both historical memory and contemporary strategies to counteract the inequities imposed by systemic discrimination and targeted marketing practices. The story of formula in Black communities thus represents a complex intersection of historical trauma, economic exploitation, and corporate influence, illustrating how patterns of infant feeding were shaped by forces far beyond individual choice and emphasizing the importance of contextualizing maternal decisions within broader social, economic, and historical frameworks. It is a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of Black mothers that, despite these challenges, they continue to seek ways to provide care, sustenance, and protection for their children, preserving the legacy of maternal devotion even in the face of systemic adversity, and demonstrating how agency, knowledge, and cultural memory can endure even under the pressures of commercial and societal forces that often sought to undermine them. As we come to the conclusion of this story, it becomes painfully clear that the historical exploitation of Black wet nurses was not an isolated injustice, but a systemic practice that left indelible marks on Black maternal health. Breastfeeding practices, and the broader societal perception of Black motherhood, reverberating across centuries and influencing generations in ways that are often under-recognized yet profoundly consequential. The legacy of forced wet nursing created a pattern in which Black women were denied agency over their own bodies and deprived of the fundamental right to nurture their own children, establishing a historical precedent that framed Black maternal labor as a resource to be commodified rather than a sacred act of care and love. This deprivation did not simply affect individual mothers or infants. It shaped collective cultural understandings, embedding stereotypes and assumptions about Black women that have persisted in subtle and overt ways, influencing medical practices, public policies, and social narratives even into the modern era. The repercussions on maternal health were both immediate and enduring. Enslaved wet nurses, exhausted from the dual burdens of field labor and the physical demands of breastfeeding someone else's child, endured chronic fatigue, malnutrition, and psychological trauma, experiences that disrupted not only their own well-being but also the development and health of their own infants, who were often fed inferior substitutes such as goat milk or contaminated water. After slavery, these systemic disadvantages were compounded by discriminatory policies, economic pressures, and corporate marketing strategies that promoted formula feeding in Black communities, perpetuating disparities in infant nutrition. Health outcomes and maternal confidence. Mothers navigated a landscape where institutional support for breastfeeding was limited, where cultural narratives frequently devalued their experiences, and where the cumulative weight of historical trauma continued to influence perceptions and decisions regarding infant care. The continuity of these patterns underscores how historical exploitation, far from being confined to the past, reverberates through the present. Shaping opportunities, behaviors, and health outcomes for countless families. Beyond health, the legacy of wet nursing profoundly influenced societal perceptions of Black motherhood. Stereotypes such as the bad Black mother or the caricatured mammy evolved from the dehumanizing experiences of enslaved women whose love and care were redirected toward children who were not their own, creating narratives that unjustly questioned their commitment, capacity, and worth as mothers. These perceptions were perpetuated by media, policy, and cultural discourse, often presenting Black women as either neglectful or hyper-resilient, forcing them to navigate the complex terrain of defending their maternal identities while addressing the real, tangible challenges of infant care under systemic constraints. Even today, echoes of these stereotypes influence societal expectations and judgments, making it essential to recognize the historical roots of these perceptions in order to dismantle them and affirm the value of Black maternal labor and love. Yet within this history of exploitation and injustice, there is also a narrative of resilience, ingenuity, and enduring maternal devotion. Black women, despite generations of systemic oppression, continue to nurture, protect, and care for their children, creating informal networks of support, preserving knowledge of maternal practices, and reclaiming agency wherever possible. Community-based solutions, cultural memory, and acts of everyday resistance provided pathways to maintain maternal bonds and safeguard infant health, highlighting the enduring strength and resourcefulness of Black mothers in the face of structural barriers designed to undermine them. These stories of resilience serve not only as a testament to the courage and tenacity of Black women throughout history, but also as an inspiration for contemporary efforts to ensure that all mothers have the support, resources, and freedom necessary to care for their children. As we reflect on this history, it becomes evident that understanding the story of Black wet nurses is not merely an exercise in historical scholarship, but a call to acknowledge the long-lasting effects of systemic exploitation, to support equity in maternal and infant health, and to honor the strength, love, and resilience of Black mothers across generations. By recognizing the injustices they endured, we not only validate their experiences, but also commit ourselves to ensuring that contemporary policies, cultural narratives, and community practices empower mothers rather than constrain them. It is a reminder that maternal care, nourishment, and love are fundamental human rights, and that the scars of the past must inform the pursuit of justice and support in the present. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this powerful and often overlooked chapter of history. Your support helps keep these stories alive and meaningful, so please remember to like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more eye-opening narratives about the Black experience. By doing, you contribute to spreading awareness, honoring the resilience of Black mothers, and fostering understanding across communities. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for watching, engaging, and remembering. May this knowledge inspire reflection, empathy, and action in your own lives.